Hi, I'm Andrew Human. Welcome to Getting to Know Grasshopper, a tutorial series for Grasshopper for Rhino. This series will cover beginner to intermediate skills and topics in Grasshopper, and you can choose to follow it in sequence or hop around from video to video. This first video will focus on the basics of the Grasshopper interface. So, the first thing we'll need to do is actually launch Grasshopper. There are a couple ways to do this. In Rhino 6 and above, there's a Grasshopper button, or what I typically do is launch Grasshopper from the Grasshopper command in the Rhino command line. So this will take a second while it loads up all my plugins. This is going to load the Grasshopper plugin, which will allow us to parametrically create geometry and interact with scripts that will kind of complement our experience in Rhino. So it's important to realize that Grasshopper sort of sits on top of Rhino and requires a running instance of Rhino, but sort of functions as a separate interface. So your interface may look slightly different from mine. I have a lot of plugins installed and things like that, but you should see roughly the same component parts. And the most important parts of this window, the Grasshopper window, are first the canvas, which is this area here, this kind of big beige area. This is where you'll be laying out your Grasshopper scripts and definitions. There's the component toolbar, which is up here, which has a few parts. This is basically your library of components or tools or functions that you can use to compose Grasshopper scripts. And you can see that there are a number of tabs up here, which are categories. The first one being params, which has a lot of the really kind of common stuff, as well as tabs that relate to specific topics like math or working with curves or working with transforms. The names get shortened when you have a lot of plugins installed like mine. Yours might look a little bit different than this. You'll also see that as you install additional plugins, you'll get additional tabs. You can also toggle this into a icon view if you want by right-clicking and choosing display as icons, but for now we'll use this display as text. So in addition to the component toolbar, there are some settings in this bar, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and the menu bar, which belongs to the Grasshopper window itself with your kind of typical file, save, open kinds of operations, as well as some settings. If you are running Grasshopper for Mac, you may find that this menu is actually at the top of your screen rather than attached to the separate Grasshopper window. So let's start by adding a component to the canvas, and then we can talk a little bit about what that actually means. So I'm going to, under the params tab, I'm going to go find the section called input. Each one of these little sections has a kind of black highlight at the bottom with a name. And if you click, it's like a drawer that pops out, which will list all of the components that are available. And the first one I'm going to place is called a number slider. So you can also see that as I hover over these, there's a little bit of a description which tells me what it is and what it's for. So that can be quite useful. So I want the one called number slider. I can pull it either here, or if I recognize the icon, I can grab it directly from up here. And I'll click it once, and you'll see that my cursor gets kind of loaded up. That's what this little icon means, is that it's holding a component. And if I click again, it'll place it on the canvas. So now that we've placed something on the canvas, we can learn a little bit more about the canvas. We can zoom in and out by scrolling, which in fact is very similar to the way that you zoom in and out of the Rhino window. And similarly, if you right-click and drag, you should be able to pan. I am on a trackpad, so I can't do that. But you can select items on the canvas and drag them around, just like you might select objects in Rhino and drag them around. And we can, if you ever lose track of where you are and you're way off in space and don't know where all your components went, these zoom controls operate a lot like the zoom commands in Rhino. You can do something like, if you click this one, it will zoom you to the entire document. Or if you have certain things selected, you can do zoom selected. And you can move specifically to different corners of the document and so on, although I don't typically use those very much. So what is a component? And in fact, this is not technically a component. It's what we call a param. It is a representation of some singular piece of data, but I may just use the shorthand of referring to all of the objects that we can place in the Grasshopper canvas as components. So there are a couple things that I want to point out. One is This little half circle with a white center and a thick black outline is an output. Inputs and outputs will look like this. And we can see this perhaps a little better if we add an additional component onto the canvas. So I'm going to go to the Curve tab and go to Primitive and find the first circle, the one with the little orange background. And again, I'm going to click it. It's going to get loaded up. And if I click, it will place it on the canvas. So you can see that this component has both an output and a couple inputs, these little circles. And when I hover over them, my cursor changes with this little sort of arrow underneath it. And it's useful to think of every component as similar to a single action or command within Rhino. So if I'm in Rhino and I want to create a circle, I'm either going to click the circle button or I can type circle up here. And what it's going to do is ask me for some information, which might be about how do you want to create the circle, or it might be critical details like where is the circle, how big is it. So this is asking me for the center of the circle. So I'll click and supply a point. And then it's asking me for the radius, or how big I want this circle to be. And right now, because my background is black, it's hard to see, but I just created a circle. And it's useful to think of the components in Grasshopper as functioning a lot like commands, in that the same way that a command asks you for certain information, like where is the center point and what is the radius, a component asks you for that information in a different way by specifying its inputs. Every component has inputs on the left and outputs on the right, and you can hover over these letters, this P and this R, to figure out what the input is, what information is it looking for. So in fact, every input is equivalent to one of the questions that a Rhino command might ask you. That won't always necessarily be one-to-one, but it'll generally be the idea in that, like, this is telling you what information do I need, and the inputs are where I supply that information. So in this case, we want to pick a point, which is going to be the location of our circle. So I have this circle over in Rhino, which I can select. Now I'm going to create a circle over here in Grasshopper. So what am I going to do? How am I going to supply information to these inputs? Well, there are a number of ways I can do it. One is to right-click and choose Set One Plane. The text here you might see could be different depending on the component. It might be Set One Curve, it might be Set One Number, but basically whatever kind of information this is looking for, you can set one or set multiple. But let's just start with Set One. So I've right-clicked the P, which represents the base plane of this circle. I'm going to say Set One Plane. And then it's actually going to hide the Grasshopper window and ask me for the information in the same way as a Rhino command. It wants to know the origin of the plane, and I'm just going to hit Enter to take the default x-axis, and now this has supplied a plane as one of the inputs to my circle. Next, I'm going to supply a radius, and the radius is a number. You can see that when I hover over it, it has this little black hexagon that says 0.1 in it, whereas this one has a little plane in its black hexagon. So those black hexagons are kind of cues as to what sort of data a component is looking for. So I'm going to set my number to be 10. So I right-click, choose Set Number, and type the value 10. And this can be a little finicky. You have to make sure you either hit Enter or click this Commit Changes in order for that to take. And now my circle has been placed over here. So the thing that makes Grasshopper different from Rhino is that, first of all, I cannot select this circle. It is not available for me to select in Rhino. But the other thing is that instead of a command that runs once, that just sort of runs at a particular point in time and then it's done, a Grasshopper graph or definition or script can be thought of as a sequence of commands that are kind of always running and updating based on changes. So what do I mean by that? If we take the output of this slider object and connect it to the input for this circle component, we can actually dynamically link the two. So this circle is looking for a radius, and this slider produces a number. So I can say use the number created by this slider to populate the radius of the circle. So if I do that, it's a different way of supplying that value. And what it will do is override whatever value I put in here before. I had set this to be 10. As soon as I plug the slider in, it's not 10 anymore. It's whatever the value of this slider is. And let's just, let's zoom in here. I'm going to hide all my text. You can see that as I change the value of this slider, the circle itself is going to change. And this is another key component of how Grasshopper works, is that effectively any value that changes sort of to the left or upstream of a component that it's wired to will change what happens with any downstream component. And we'll get a sense of this as we keep building. So let's look a little more at this component. In addition to being able to right-click inputs and set their values or connect them to things, we can also hover over the middle of a component to see a more detailed description of what it is and does. So this is telling me that it's creating a circle defined by a base plane and a radius. So in the same way that when I type the circle command in Rhino, there are a few different ways. You can do a circle through 3 points, you can do a circle around a curve, and so on. There might be multiple ways to create circles, and in fact there are. You can create a circle defined by a base plane and radius, a circle based on its center, normal, and radius, multiple tangents, 3 points, fit through multiple points, and so on. So there may be many ways to produce the same kind of thing in Grasshopper. So let's go ahead and let's make something else. Why don't we construct a point? So right now, we specified a single point as the input to this base plane. Let's actually create and control a point. So I'm going to create a point. In Rhino, when we create a point object, it's just this sort of thing. It's specified in space. I can also, when I create a point in Rhino, I can type an x, y, and z coordinate. So if I make this 5, 5, 0, then it's going to make a point at a particular location in space, which is 5 units to the right and 5 units up from the origin, which is defined by the kind of base grid that we have in Rhino. I'm just toggling that on and off with F7 just to hide and show it in the Rhino interface. So we can construct and control a point using a component under the Vector tab called Point Construct Point. So under Vector, Point, Construct Point, we can create a point by specifying its x, y, and z coordinates. So I'm going to create a few more sliders that are going to populate this, because I can see when I look at this component that it expects a number. Remember that little 0.1 represents a number, and it wants an x coordinate, a y coordinate, and a z coordinate. So let's make a few more sliders. So I'm going to go back to params, go to input, and go find another number slider. And I'm going to plug this in, and I'm going to do 2 more. And I'm going to plug these into y and z. And you'll notice that these sliders automatically take on the name of the thing that you plug them into. But if you want, you can also right-click. And anytime you see this white field at the top, this is true for both components and params and other objects, you can give it a custom name like my y coordinate. So that's helpful if you want this to mean something other than just a y coordinate, or it's helpful if you use a value in multiple places, you can designate what it actually refers to. So one thing we'll notice is that these sliders only go from 0 to 1. And presumably, in a lot of cases, we're going to want to be able to create points at other positions in space. So how can we do that? If you right-click a slider, it has some special menu options like Edit. And if you go to Edit, it will bring up this Slider Properties panel where you can specify a name. This is the same thing I did before. I can call this my x coordinate. And I can specify what type of number it's meant to represent. This can be a little bit confusing, but effectively R represents the real or floating point numbers, N represents integers or whole numbers. So if you want 0.5, it'll have to be a real number. An integer is only like 1, 2, 3, or 4, and so on. Or you can also lock it to only even numbers or only odd numbers and control how much precision, how many decimal places there are I can put on this slider. Under numeric domain, I can also specify what the range of this slider is. And I recommend changing the min and max and letting the range be calculated automatically. It'll be more controllable. So I'll leave the min at 0, and I'll set the max to be 20. And again, whenever you see one of these options to, a kind of green check mark in a circle, you'll want to click that to make sure that it takes, because you can accidentally click away and not have the change you made take effect if you don't do that. So let's go ahead, click OK. And now I can make this x coordinate be anywhere between 0 and 20. So let's see. One other thing that we can do with components is we can copy and paste them. So I don't want to necessarily drill down and edit the individual values of all of these sliders. So I'm actually going to delete Y and Z. I'm just hitting the delete key. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to do Control-C, Control-V in order to copy-paste. And maybe I'll rename this. And I'm just right-clicking to pull up this menu and clicking in the little white text area in order to edit the name. And I'm going to control this. And now, if I plug this point, which is created, into the base plane of the circle, it's actually going to serve as the center of that circle. So now, with these sliders, I can both move the circle and change its radius. And I might want to go in here and allow myself to have a larger radius too. Let's set this to a max radius of 100, and then click OK. And I just got there by right-clicking and choosing Edit. So now we can make the circle much bigger. So a few other things I want to highlight. I mentioned before that I cannot select this object in Rhino like I can this point, which I created before. And that is because this is sort of like, you can think of it as like virtual geometry. The stuff you're creating in Grasshopper is virtual in the sense that it doesn't actually exist in Rhino. And the way we make it exist in Rhino is via an operation called bake. And I've never been totally clear why it's called bake. I've been even less clear why. As you'll see, the icon for it is a little fried egg, which has very little to do with baking. But in any case, if you would like to take some piece of geometry and make it available in the Rhino world, so you can do things like, run commands on it or modify it or whatever, you can select a component and right-click the canvas and choose Bake. There are a lot of these operations that you'll want to select the component itself. It'll turn green over here. Right-click and choose Bake. And it doesn't look like much has happened, but in fact, it has created a copy of the geometry I had in Rhino, and now I can select it and do things with it. But the important thing to know about this operation is that it is no longer what we call parametric. It's no longer controlled by the parameters or upstream values we've set in other parts of the definition. So this is now just a piece of geometry like any other in Rhino, and it no longer has any attachment to your Grasshopper window. So one way you can use this is to make it kind of like a stamp. I can bake this a couple times, and I can say, actually, now let's shift it down in the Y like this, and let's make it a little smaller, and we'll go like this, or something. So you can bake as many times as you'd like. The other thing I'll highlight is that when you click on a component in Grasshopper that represents some piece of geometry, it turns green by default in the Rhino window. So geometry has a default display color of this kind of transparent dark red, but when you select a component in the Grasshopper interface, it will turn green to let you know that that is the thing represented by this component. So this component is responsible for this point. This component is responsible for this green circle. And at a certain point, we may want to have control over this. Maybe this point was important for us to define the location of the circle, but it's no longer something we want to see. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll hide the preview of components that produce this geometry in the Rhino viewport so that we only see the things we care about. This is another one of these operations where you'll select a component. You can either right-click it in the middle and choose this preview guy. There's a little like head, and that will, if you click it, that will sort of unselect the preview. Or you can select multiple components at once, right-click the canvas and choose preview off. And that's typically how I do it. It's very easy to just sort of quickly select a handful of components and turn them on and off together. And I'll just turn off the preview of the point, and now I only see the circle, but that point is still there. It still exists, it's just not visible in the Rhino viewport. You can also, at any point, turn off all of the preview of components in Grasshopper. So when I say preview, I mean this kind of virtual geometry displayed in red. And sometimes we may want to just see the geometry that's in Rhino, like if I have a model, some sort of a box or whatever, I want to see that, and I don't want to see anything that's in Grasshopper. So these controls allow us to change the way geometry is previewed. This one, don't draw any preview geometry, will hide all of your Grasshopper geometry from the viewport. And that can be useful if you just want to see the difference between what you have in Grasshopper versus what you have in Rhino. The normal default setting is the sort of solid red cylinder. The middle one turns it into a wireframe view, which really only matters if you're dealing with like meshes and surfaces. We might see that a little later. But the other one that I want to point out, which is quite useful, is this green or sort of half green cylinder, which is called only draw preview for selected objects. And this is really useful, especially when you have larger definitions, because it allows you to sort of step through everything you've built. So when I click this, even though this is set to a full display, nothing will show up in the Rhino viewport until I select it in Rhino. So at this moment, it was kind of obscured, but you can see that now the point is visible, but as soon as I deselect it, it goes away. The circle is visible. As soon as I deselect it, it goes away. But if I have multiple points, I can see, or multiple things selected, I can see everything at once. So that can be a really useful way to debug and just kind of see one part of the logic of your definition at a time. So the last thing I want to show you is that Grasshopper definitions are independent of Rhino documents in a way. Oftentimes they'll go together, but they are separate files. And so if I open up this Rhino document, I won't have the Grasshopper document associated with it automatically. So instead, what I have to do is actually save this Grasshopper file. So just like anything else, I can say File, Save Document, and then choose a place for it, and I'll say Demo Script. And I can now close out of this. And I can quit Rhino altogether, and then when I reopen it, I can open that document with File, Open, Demo Script. And the other thing to be aware of with files is that, in fact, you can have multiple definitions open at once. So let's see if I can find another definition. Let's see. Let's pick a big complex one like this one. And so I may want to switch between active documents. So in the same way you can kind of have multiple instances of Rhino open, you can have multiple Grasshopper documents open at a time, although only one will ever be active at once. So I can switch back and forth between my demo script and this definition, which is a little more complex. You may notice here also that components sometimes turn different colors. We've already seen over here, although I didn't point it out, that some components are a dark gray and others are a light gray. And all this means is that a component that's light gray is both capable of previewing something and its preview is enabled. So if I turn off this mode, I can see that the circle is set to display its geometry in the Rhino viewport, and this one is not. The one that generates the point is not. So if I right-click and choose Preview On, now it'll turn to the light gray, and that means it's showing something. So that's a visual cue that you have some geometry that is rendering something to the Rhino view. The other thing is that I mentioned that components can turn other colors as well. If we supply some sort of an invalid piece of data, so let's find an example of this. I'm going to create a text panel, which is this yellow scribble thing right here, which is a way to both display and input data. And I'm going to make some gibberish information. And I'm going to plug this in as the center point of my circle. And it's going to yell at me. It's going to turn red and put this little bubble up to warn me that it was unable to convert the text I supplied into a plane. So whenever a component is turning a color, it doesn't necessarily mean that anything is wrong, but it means that the component had trouble doing something it thought it should be able to do. And you can usually hover over this little bubble that pops up to see what the problem was, although sometimes it takes a little getting used to understand what these errors mean. You may have noticed that when I plugged this in, it actually replaced the input from here. When you drag a wire into an input that already has a wire, it will replace that wire for you, unless you hold down Shift, in which case it will try and add them both. We'll look at that a little more when we start to look at lists. But if you want to disconnect all the wires going into an input, you can right-click and choose Disconnect, and then specify each individual wire, which we'll highlight in red, and say, I want to disconnect this panel. So I think that's it for our kind of initial interface overview. There are lots of fun little nuances and other things that we'll cover as we go along. There's a lot of information here in our panels, but this should be enough to kind of get you started. And hopefully, as you follow the other tutorials, you'll learn a little bit more about the Grasshopper interface. Hope this has been helpful, and see you at the next one.